What happens when a young handyman fixes an older woman's light and she asks, "Are you lonely?" Their connection, once just a repair, became something profoundly unexpected and irreversible. The persistent, asthmatic hum of the old fluorescent fixture in the kitchen of apartment 4B had become Alara Finch's nightly tormentor. It wasn't just a faulty light, it was a physical manifestation of the quiet decay that had settled into the corners of her life since Edward's passing. Every erratic flicker cast a long, dancing shadow that amplified the silence, turning her evenings into an echoing chamber of solitude. She'd tried to fix it herself, of course, with a stubborn determination born of self-reliance, but her attempts had only yielded a sprinkle of brittle plastic and a deeper sense of futility. Finally, with a sigh that carried the weight of years, she admitted defeat. Her gaze drifted to the communal corkboard in the lobby of the Rosewood Manor Apartments, an ancient bulletin board cluttered with faded notices. A crisp, new flyer stood out. Local handyman services, Reese Beaumont, small repairs, big solutions. Reese Beaumont, apartment 1C. She knew him by sight, a young man, barely more than a boy in her eyes, with a perpetual stack of engineering textbooks clutched in his arm, his dark hair always a little untamed, and a thoughtful, almost solemn frown etched between his brows. He looked 23, perhaps, still possessing that earnest, slightly bewildered air of someone navigating the cusp of true independence. Alara, at 38, felt a chasm of unspoken experience yawning between them. Calling him felt less like a practical necessity and more like an admission of a deeper need, a surrender to the creeping tendrils of loneliness she usually managed to keep at bay. But the light was broken. That Saturday morning, the air in her small kitchen was thick with the rich, dark aroma of her freshly brewed coffee. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, highlighting the quiet stillness of the space that was hers and hers alone. Alara, dressed in a simple, well-worn denim shirt and dark trousers, ran a hand through her auburn hair, which she'd pulled back into a loose, unstudied ponytail. Her thumb hovered over the number on the flyer, the plastic of her phone feeling surprisingly heavy. It felt like an intrusion, a reaching out beyond the polite nods exchanged in the hallway or the brief murmured pleasantries by the mailboxes. Loneliness, a persistent ache she'd learned to live with, was a private matter, not something to be addressed by a repair request. Yet the light, stubborn and flickering, mocked her self-sufficiency. With a decisive breath, she pressed dial. Reese answered on the second ring, his voice a little deeper than she'd expected, rough with the vestiges of sleep. "Beaumont," he stated rather than asked, the word clipped and efficient. "Reese, this is Alara Finch from 4B, she began, feeling an inexplicable warmth creep up her neck, a blush she hadn't experienced in years. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I saw your flyer in the lobby, my kitchen light. It's been acting up and I can't seem to fix it." There was a moment of silence on the other end, just the faint, distant sound of city traffic suggesting an open window. "Oh, right, the flickering fluorescent. I think I've noticed that from the courtyard. Sounds like a ballast issue or maybe just a loose starter. I can take a look if you're free this morning." His tone was purely professional, devoid of any discernible emotion, which strangely both relieved and disappointed her. "Yes, I'm free all day," Alara said, perhaps a little too eagerly. She cleared her throat. "Would 10 o'clock work for you?" "10 it is," he confirmed. "I'll be there." At precisely 10 minutes past 10, a soft, almost hesitant knock echoed through Ilara's apartment. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing the front of her shirt before opening the door. Reese stood there, a large, well-organized toolkit in one hand, a small, rather ancient-looking multimeter in the other. He wore faded, comfortable jeans and a dark gray t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. His dark eyes, surprisingly intense and observant, met hers briefly before he offered a polite, almost shy smile. "Morning, Ms. Finch," he said, stepping inside after she gestured him in. His voice was softer in person, less formal than on the phone. "Elara, please," she corrected gently, leading him towards the kitchen. The flickering light seemed to intensify its erratic dance, as if deliberately drawing attention to its malfunction. Reese glanced up at the offending fixture, his brow furrowed in concentration, the lines deeper than she'd noticed before. He pulled a small foldable stepladder from his toolkit, his movements efficient and quiet. He worked methodically, his hands precise and unhurried as he tested the voltage, removed the old fluorescent tube, and then, with the small, well-used screwdriver, began to dismantle the casing. The air in the kitchen, usually so still and imbued with the subtle scent of her own solitude, now hummed with a different kind of energy. The quiet intensity of another presence, a male presence. Elara found herself watching him, her gaze lingering on the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead as he leaned into his work, revealing the pale skin of his nape. There was a quiet competence about him, a focused determination that was strangely compelling. She realized with a jolt that she was holding her breath. "It's definitely the ballast," he announced, pulling out a burnt-smelling component, a faint acrid scent lingering in the air. "Looks like it's been on its last legs for a while. I have a spare in my kit, should fit right in." He worked for another 20 minutes, the rhythmic clicks and soft clanks of tools filling the silence. Elara found herself offering him coffee, which he politely declined, and then, inexplicably, she began to tell him about her week. A mundane recounting of her work as an archivist at the Stonebridge Historical Society, the challenging cataloging of a newly acquired collection of old maritime charts, the unexpected heavy rain that had ruined her plans for a quiet walk in Larkspur Park. He listened, occasionally offering a quiet, or "I see," his eyes never leaving his work, his focus unwavering. It was an odd, one-sided conversation, yet it felt strangely comforting to speak, to have someone listen, even if their primary attention was elsewhere. Finally, with a soft, almost triumphant click, the new ballast was installed. He replaced the cover, slid in a fresh fluorescent tube, and then, with a flick of the wall switch, the kitchen was bathed in a clear, steady, unwavering light. It was a small thing, a simple repair, but to Elara it felt monumental. The oppressive flicker, a metaphor for the unstable, frayed edges of her own quiet life, was gone, replaced by a calm, consistent glow. Reese stepped down from the ladder, gathering his tools with the same quiet efficiency. He seemed to fill the small space, his presence somehow larger, more substantial now that his work was done. "There you go. Should be good as new for years." Elara felt a lump form in her throat, a sudden wave of gratitude mixed with something she couldn't quite name. "Thank you, Reese. Truly. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it." She fumbled in her pocket for her wallet. "What do I owe you?" He waved a hand dismissively, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "No charge for that, just a quick fix. Glad I could help." He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on packing his tools into their designated slots in the metal box. "No, I insist," Elara countered, pulling out a crisp $50 bill, her fingers trembling slightly. "Please, you spent your Saturday morning on this." He hesitated, then slowly took the bill, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. A jolt, unexpected and electric, passed between them, a sudden awareness that transcended the simple exchange of money. His eyes, dark and searching, finally met hers, and for a moment the quiet confidence gave way to something else, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a hint of something unreadable, deeply felt. "Thank you, Alara," he said, the use of her first name feeling suddenly intimate, a small yet significant departure from the formality. He turned to leave, his movement still precise, but now with a subtle shift in rhythm, as if the air around them had thickened, grown denser with unspoken possibilities. As he reached the doorway, he paused, his hand on the frame, his shoulders slightly hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. The new, steady light illuminated his profile, highlighting the strong lines of his nose and jaw. He didn't turn fully, but his head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Is there anything else, Alara?" His voice was quiet, just above a whisper, laced with an undertone she couldn't quite identify. Alara's breath caught. The question hung in the air, weighted with something more than simple polite inquiry. It felt like an invitation, a gentle probe into the quiet, often ignored corners of her life. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city and the steady thrum of her own heartbeat. She wanted to say so many things. She wanted to say, "Yes, there's so much more. There's the loneliness that hums louder than any broken light fixture. There's the ache of a past I can't quite shake, the quiet despair of a future that seems to stretch out empty." But the words caught in her throat, strangled by years of self-imposed silence and the ingrained habit of protecting her own vulnerable spaces. Instead, she simply stared at the steady, unwavering light in her kitchen, a beacon in the sudden, profound stillness of the room. "You won't believe who took his side. This is just the start. It gets stronger." The days that followed Reese's visit to Alara's apartment were infused with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere of the Rosewood Manor apartments. The steady, comforting light in Alara's kitchen served as a constant, tangible reminder of his presence, a silent testament to the brief, unexpected connection that had formed. She found herself lingering a little longer in the lobby, her eyes casually scanning for a glimpse of him, a fleeting exchange of glances. When they did cross paths, at the mailboxes or by the communal laundry room in the echoing basement of Building C, their polite nods were now accompanied by a shared, almost conspiratorial glance, a hint of something unsaid passing between them. The professional distance had thinned, replaced by a fragile, almost translucent thread of mutual awareness. The unspoken began to hum beneath the surface of their mundane interactions. One Tuesday afternoon, a week after the light repair, Alara was returning from the Evergreen Farmers Market, her arms laden with a heavy, overflowing basket of fresh produce. She struggled with the main door to the apartment complex, her grip slipping, her arms aching from the weight, when Reese, emerging from the small convenience store on the bustling corner of Maplewood Avenue, noticed her predicament. He quickened his pace, his long strides covering the distance swiftly, reaching the door just as she fumbled, keys clattering against the metal. "Let me get that for you, Alara," he offered, his voice low and calm, a quiet ripple in the afternoon air. He held the heavy glass and metal door open, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a small, genuine smile as she murmured her thanks, a faint, unbidden blush spreading across her cheeks. He didn't leave. Instead, he walked with her to the elevator, a silent, comforting presence at her side, and then, without a word, pushed the button for her floor, the quiet hum of the mechanism filling the space between them. "Heavy load today," he commented, a slight smile still playing on his lips, a warmth radiating from him that seemed to push back the usual chill of the hallway. "Yes, I went a little overboard at the market," she admitted, feeling a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in a long, long time. The elevator ride was silent, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was filled with the subtle hum of the mechanism, the soft whoosh of the doors, and the unspoken acknowledgement of their shared, confined space. When the elevator doors opened on her floor, he followed her out. "Let me help you with that," he said, gently taking the overflowing basket from her, his fingers brushing hers again. This time, the spark was unmistakable, a warmth that spread through her fingertips and up her arm, a silent electric current. He carried the basket to her door, waiting patiently while she fumbled with her keys, her hands suddenly clumsy. "Thank you, Reese," she said, her voice a little breathy, her gaze fluttering to his face. She gestured inside, a spontaneous, almost desperate invitation forming on her lips. Would you like a glass of water? Or a cup of tea? I just made a fresh batch of iced lemon tea." He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking from her expectant face to the inviting, albeit still, interior of her apartment, a quiet battle playing out in his dark eyes. A fleeting shadow crossed his features, a ripple of something akin to caution or perhaps profound internal debate. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible nod, he said, his voice a little softer now, "Iced tea sounds good. Thank you, Alara." He stepped inside, placing the basket carefully on her small kitchen table, the same worn table where she had sat alone for countless meals, countless quiet evenings. The afternoon sun, now lower in the sky, cast long golden shadows through the living room, illuminating the quiet domesticity of her space. It felt different now, infused with a new, tentative energy, a subtle shift in its very essence. Ilara busied herself with pouring the tea, her hands trembling slightly as the ice clinked against the glass. She offered him a glass, its condensation cool against her palm. He sat at the small table, his elbows resting on the worn surface, his long fingers wrapped around the cool glass. He didn't speak, simply sipped his tea, his eyes surveying the room with a quiet, observant intensity, taking in every detail. "It's a nice place," he finally offered, his gaze settling on a framed photograph on a nearby bookshelf. A younger Alara, her smile wide and carefree, standing beside a man whose face was blurry with age and the passage of time. Edward, her late husband. The photograph was a relic, a silent sentinel of a past she rarely spoke of, a constant reminder of a life that once was. "It's home," she replied, her voice soft, tinged with a familiar melancholic undercurrent she couldn't quite suppress. She sat opposite him, her own glass of tea untouched, the faint scent of lemon and black tea filling the air. He nodded, his gaze still on the photograph, a thoughtful frown returning to his brow. "You've lived here long?" "Almost 15 years, she answered, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. "Edward and I bought it together, before he passed." The last words were a whisper, almost swallowed by the profound quiet of the room, a secret shared with the dusty motes in the sunbeams. Reese's eyes finally left the photograph and met hers. There was no pity in his gaze, no forced sympathy. Only a quiet understanding, a depth she hadn't expected from someone so young, a recognition of a shared human burden. "I'm sorry, Alara," he said, his voice gentle, devoid of any saccharine sweetness. a long time to be on your own." The simplicity of his words, the directness of his acknowledgment, pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. It wasn't a question, but a statement of empathy, a recognition of her solitude. A fresh wave of loneliness, sharp and raw, washed over her, unexpected and overwhelming. She found herself clutching the cold glass in her hands, her knuckles white against the dark glass. "It is," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion, a single tear, unbidden, tracing a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by her raw vulnerability, by the sudden wellspring of emotion. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply watched her, his gaze steady, unwavering, accepting. Then with a quiet sigh, he pushed his glass aside and leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table, a subtle shift that felt like an unspoken invitation to intimacy. "You know," he began, his voice a low murmur, filled with a hesitant sincerity, "I moved into this building just after my grandmother passed. She was the one who encouraged me to go into engineering. Said I had a good head for fixing things. She lived in a small cottage just outside Willow Creek, full of her old books and trinkets. After she was gone, it felt empty, too quiet. I needed a change." He paused, his eyes reflecting a distant memory, a faint shadow passing over them. This apartment felt like a new start, but even here sometimes the silence can be deafening." Alara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a young man, but a fellow traveler on the quiet, often desolate road of grief and solitude. His admission, so unexpected, so raw, felt like a bridge forming between them, spanning the age gap, the different life experiences. It was a shared understanding of a particular kind of ache, a raw vulnerability that transcended their superficial differences, a mutual recognition of the profound human need for connection. "It is," she agreed, her voice barely audible, a profound echo of his sentiment. The silence. It amplifies everything, doesn't it? He nodded, a faint melancholic smile touching his lips, a shared understanding flickering between them. "It does. You find yourself talking to the plants or the furniture just to hear a voice, to fill the void." A fragile laugh escaped Alara, thin and reedy, but genuine, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. "I do that too," she confessed, a warmth spreading through her chest, a strange, comforting sensation that felt almost foreign yet deeply welcome. The conversation flowed, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease, like a tentative stream finding its banks. They spoke of the quiet challenges of independent life, the small victories and defeats of their daily routines. He told her about his engineering studies at the Academy of Applied Sciences, his ambition to work on sustainable energy projects, his fascination with the complex intricacies of the universe, his hopes for a future that stretched before him, bright and unwritten. She in turn spoke of the quiet satisfaction she found in preserving history, the hidden stories held within forgotten documents, the quiet solace of the past, a past that held both joy and profound sorrow. There was no pretense, no artifice, just two souls, unburdened by expectations, sharing the raw edges of their realities, discovering common ground in unexpected places. Hours slipped by, unnoticed. The afternoon light softened, deepening into a rich golden hue, casting long, ethereal streaks across the apartment, turning the dust motes into tiny, glittering particles. The iced tea glasses were empty, the ice long since melted. The silence that had once felt oppressive was now comfortable, punctuated by the soft murmur of their voices, the occasional sigh, the gentle clinking of phantom ice in their empty glasses. Reese finally stirred, looking at his watch with a start. a subtle shift in his posture, a hint of the outside world intruding. "I should go. I have a night class tonight." He rose from the table, and Alara felt a pang of disappointment, a sudden chill in the air, as if the warmth of their connection was already receding. "Of course," she said, rising with him, her movements stiff, reluctant. "Thank you for staying, Reese. It was nice." The word felt inadequate, too small, too mundane to describe the profound shift she felt within her, the quiet blossoming of something she hadn't known she was missing. He walked to the door, his movements slower than before, imbued with a strange, almost heavy reluctance. As he reached the threshold, he paused, turning back to face her fully. The golden light from the window, now a deep amber, illuminated his face, softening the sharp angles, revealing a hint of something deeper in his dark eyes, a quiet questioning. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, then gently, almost reverently, he touched the single tear track that had dried on her cheek, a faint shimmer of salt left behind. His thumb brushed lightly against her skin, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through her, a tremor that started at her jaw and spread through her entire being. "Alara," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. He dropped his hand, and the air between them crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of that fleeting contact. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers, and in their depths she saw a reflection of her own vulnerability, a mirror of the loneliness that resided within them both, a silent echo. What happens now, no one expected, but it's what restores fairness. The air in the hallway, usually neutral, anonymous, now felt charged, thick with the lingering scent of tea and the profound weight of an unspoken intimacy. Reese's hand, after that fleeting, tender touch, dropped to his side, but his gaze remained fixed on Alara's, a silent, potent question hanging between them, pulling at the threads of their carefully maintained composure. The streetlights outside the Rosewood Manor apartments had begun to glow, casting a soft, artificial twilight into the apartment, the encroaching dusk mirroring the deepening shadows of their emotional landscape. The vibrant, life-affirming glow of the newly fixed kitchen light felt almost like a silent witness to the fragile, nascent connection unfolding between them. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the sudden, profound quiet. She felt exposed, laid bare by the raw honesty of their afternoon conversation, by the tender, almost accidental touch that had ignited a forgotten spark within her. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of warring emotions, fear, longing, a deep, aching tenderness, and the ever-present, insistent voice of propriety, of what was right and allowed. He was so much younger, so full of nascent life, of possibilities yet unwritten, while she felt like a relic, a faded photograph, a story already largely told. The sheer impossibility of it, the absurdity of the pull she felt, was almost comical, yet utterly consuming. "Alara," he repeated, his voice a low, resonant murmur, filled with a hesitant sincerity that vibrated through her very bones. He took a small, deliberate step closer, not invading her space, but simply diminishing the physical distance between them, a subtle shift that felt monumental, a crossing of an invisible boundary. His eyes, usually so composed, so observant, now held a vulnerability that mirrored her own, an almost childlike openness that disarmed her completely. "Are you lonely?" The question, simple yet profound, landed like a stone in the still glassy waters of her carefully constructed defenses. It wasn't accusatory, wasn't a demand or an inquiry born of idle curiosity. It was a gentle, empathetic probe, a quiet acknowledgment of a truth she had buried deep within herself, beneath layers of routine and forced composure. It was the question no one had dared to ask, the truth she had avoided acknowledging, even to herself, for years. To hear it spoken aloud, by him, was both terrifying and exquisitely liberating. A choked sound escaped her throat, a mixture of a gasp and a ragged sob, the sound raw and unfamiliar even to her own ears. Her eyes, suddenly swimming with unshed tears, blurred his features, turning him into a soft, indistinct shape in the encroaching dusk. The loneliness, a constant, often dull companion she had learned to endure, now felt unbearable, overwhelming her with its sheer, crushing weight. It was a physical ache, a cavern in her chest. She took a shaky breath, struggling to find her voice, to give form to the emotions swirling within her. "Yes, Reese," she whispered, the word a ragged, torn confession ripped from the deepest, most guarded part of her soul. Yes, I am. So lonely." The admission, once terrifying, now felt strangely liberating, a truth finally given voice after years of stifling silence, a silent scream finally allowed to echo. The tears finally spilled, hot and relentless, tracing warm paths down her cheeks, mingling with the faint, lingering residue of his touch. He didn't move, didn't try to comfort her with a clumsy physical embrace. He simply stood there, absorbing her pain, his gaze steady and compassionate, a silent anchor in her emotional storm. The silence stretched again, but this time it was a silence filled not with awkwardness, but with profound understanding, with the quiet, potent power of two souls acknowledging a shared vulnerability, a mutual ache for connection. It was a language spoken without words. Then, with a deliberate slowness that spoke of immense internal struggle, of a battle fought and won within himself, he raised his hand again. This time, his fingers didn't just brush her cheek. They gently, reverently, cradled her jaw, his thumb wiping away a fresh tear, his touch surprisingly firm, yet infinitely tender, a subtle pressure that felt both grounding and electric. His thumb lingered there, a warm anchor against her cool, damp skin. His dark eyes, so close now, searched hers, and in their depths she saw a flicker of something raw and exposed, something that mirrored her own desperate longing for comfort, for understanding, a silent mirroring of souls. "You don't have to be, Ilara," he murmured, his voice husky, barely audible above the insistent pounding of her heart, a cadence that felt like a drum solo in her chest. The words were not a promise, not a declaration of grand intent, but a quiet offering, a lifeline extended across the chasm of their differences, across the years that separated them. It was a recognition that loneliness, a universal human experience, did not have to be borne alone, that shared burdens could lighten the load. His head lowered, slowly, incrementally, a deliberate, almost agonizing descent. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat, catching painfully. Time seemed to suspend itself, every nerve ending in her body hyper-aware of his proximity. The faint, clean scent of his skin, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle shift in the air as he drew closer. She could feel the soft, warm brush of his breath against her lips, the subtle tremor that ran through him. Her eyes fluttered shut, a silent surrender to the inevitability of the moment, to the magnetic, irresistible pull that had been steadily building between them, a force beyond logic or reason, a light, tentative touch. His lips, soft and hesitant, met hers. It was not a passionate kiss, not demanding or urgent, not a firework display. It was a whisper, a question, a gentle exploration, a tentative crossing of a long-held boundary. It tasted of shared solitude, of unspoken pain, and of a fragile, nascent hope that flickered to life in the deepening twilight. It was a connection that transcended words, a silent acknowledgment of the deep emotional bond that had irrevocably formed, a soul-deep resonance. Ilara responded, her own lips parting slightly, a soft sigh escaping her, a sound that was half release, half plea. Her hands, almost without conscious thought, lifted and rested lightly on his forearms, feeling the subtle tension of his muscles beneath her fingertips, the solid warmth of him. It was a silent agreement, a mutual surrender to the impossible, to the forbidden, to the profoundly human, desperate need for closeness, for an end to the crushing weight of isolation. When he finally pulled back, slowly, reluctantly, their foreheads still touched, their breaths mingling in the quiet air. Their eyes opened, meeting in the dim light, heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of the moment that had just passed. His dark eyes were shadowed, filled with a mixture of tenderness, apprehension, and a deep, unsettling clarity, a recognition of something profound. Ilara saw her own reflection in them, a woman transformed, no longer just lonely, but suddenly, intensely, profoundly alive, awakened from a long slumber. He didn't say anything. There were no grand declarations, no promises of a future stretching before them. There was only the quiet hum of the building around them, the distant, muted sounds of the city preparing for night, and the steady, unwavering light in her kitchen, casting its gentle, unchanging glow on two people who had found an unexpected, improbable connection in the quiet confines of an apartment hallway. His thumb, still on her jaw, stroked lightly, a soothing, comforting gesture, a final lingering caress. Then, with a profound sigh that seemed to carry the weight of everything unsaid, every unspoken possibility, he finally, slowly, released her and took a decisive step back, breaking the physical connection, yet leaving an indelible mark. He turned and walked to the elevator, his shoulders a little heavier than before, as if burdened by the raw emotion of the encounter. He pressed the down arrow, and the doors swished open with a soft, mechanical sigh. He stepped inside, his back to her, a silent, retreating figure. Just before the doors closed completely, he turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for one last lingering moment, a gaze that held a universe of unspoken feeling. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent farewell, a silent acknowledgment of what had just transpired between them, a mutual understanding that transcended words. Then the doors slid shut with a soft click, leaving Ilara standing alone in the quiet hallway, the memory of his touch, his kiss, and his question reverberating through her, a powerful echo that would stay with her long after the light in her kitchen was finally switched off for the night. The air between them was different now. Forever